All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. For this conversation, I'm taking things in a slightly different direction than normal. I'm speaking with a guest who worked more behind the scenes in the music industry, specifically in the 70s and 80s, primarily. He's worked with many of the artists who've been discussed on this channel already and has some very interesting insight into some acts that my viewers would certainly know. With that said, it's my great pleasure to welcome, joining me from the UK, Mr. Alec Byrn. Alec, pleasure to have you here, sir.
Good day, Joel. Nice one, mate.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, let me thank our mutual friend, Paulie Williams from Light of Eternity, for contacting me about the possibility of this conversation and putting some work in to make it possible. So thank you, Paulie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paulie. It's your fault. I love him, mate.
Well, we'll see if there's any fault to be had by the end of it.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes. But for the viewer who's unfamiliar with Alec, he has a staggering history in the industry, working with several artists, primarily through the EG Records label, as well as Polydor and some other facets as well. Tons of artists that we'll get into, a tremendous history. So I'm really looking forward to diving in from a different perspective with this conversation. But first and foremost, Alec, we were chatting a little bit before we started recording about some of your earlier exposure to music and what was happening in those days. So let's kind of start at the very beginning for you. Um, what was your initial exposure to music? Did you grow up in a household where music was common, or was it something you sort of discovered on your own?
Well, my father was a clergyman. He was a clergyman, and he was quite an old father, really. He was 49 when I was born. And he loved his Irish tenor because he was Irish, basically. He loved his Irish tenors and that sort of music. So I wasn't really exposed to too much popular music, to say the least. I think the first music that really grabbed me was I must have been about 8 years old, and it was a track by Sandy Nelson, "Let There Be Drums,"
Mhm.
and me and my mates at school we just loved it, and that sort of grabbed me. But then as I went through school, it was in the '60s. Obviously, the the fashion then was very much being a hippie, I suppose, smoking a bit of dope, patchouli oil, loon pants, and all of that. And I got dragged along with that. I think the band that really impressed me in the early days was a band called the Pretty Things,
Mm.
who were as good, if not better, than the Rolling Stones. Dick Taylor, Big Prince, Phil May on vocals, Ryan Pennant on bass. They were fantastic. Went to see them in Manchester at the Electric Circus when I was about 17, 16, 17. That really grabbed me. And then I left school, did a business degree, which was a sandwich course, but it was my employer was a major international civil engineering petrochemical company, and I ended up being a buyer of
Hmm.
steel, which is very current at the moment. And I was bored stiff about 2 or 3 years after qualifying from college. And my girlfriend saw an ad in the newspaper, Daily Telegraph, for a buyer at Phonodisc, which was the pressing plant for Phonogram and Polydor.
Hmm.
So I applied for that, and I went for an interview, and I was offered the job, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to not work at the factory, buy PVC pellets and cardboard sleeves and whatever. So I turned it down. But the wonderful human resources lady that interviewed me, she got in touch with me 2 months later and said, "There's a job going at the record company at Phonogram." So I went for the interview, and I was very lucky I got the job.
Hmm.
Um, and it was a bit like a dream come true. So I started working in the marketing operations of that record company, which was the link between the record company, the pressing plant, and the distribution, all the same company. Did that for a couple of years, and there was a vacancy for product manager came up, contemporary product manager. The post wasn't filled. I didn't think I was capable of doing it, but somebody said you should have a go for it. So I did. And there I was, contemporary product manager. And it sort of went on from there, Joel, really. I worked with, in those days, there was Eddie Grant, The Equals, a band called 90 Degrees Inclusive, The Pioneers. There was releases that we had through Trojan Records, Sharon Forrester. And then we got the deal, Phonogram got the deal for Europe and the rest of the world with Sire Records, which was Seymour Stein. So that was the Ramones and Talking Heads. So I was label manager for them for their first tour. July the 4th, 1976 at the Roundhouse, which really kicked off a lot of the punk scene over here. And obviously the Talking Heads came in later. Flaming Groovies, the Ramones were supporting the Flaming Groovies. They were a fantastic band. And then Nigel Grange, bless him, his younger brother is now CEO of Universal Music Group, Lucy and Grange. His brother basically decided to leave. His brother Nigel was head of A&R, very good at his job, and he started his own label, Ensign, and signed the Boomtown Rats, and we went to see them over in Dublin. So working with Bob Geldof and Boomtown Rats and Faulkner and Kelly, who's their manager. And that was all very good times, man, really good times. But I left Phonogram and spent 2 years, or nearly 2 years, managing this band called the 90 Degrees Inclusive, all black band, mixture of rock and reggae. Very, very good band. Very, very good band indeed. And then one day, and I was pretty broke at the time, to be perfectly honest, Joe. I got a phone call from the personnel manager for Phonogram and Polydor, who said that my old MD at Phonogram had gone to Polydor as MD wanted to see if I'd like to come in and have a chat about being label manager for EG. Which I did, and I was offered the job. And to be perfectly honest, one of the reasons was that Tony Morris, who was the MD, he'd just taken on, well, Polydor had just taken on the EG catalogue after Island. And the two guys that ran EG, upper class thugs, nice. They weren't thugs really, but that's just an expression. They were tough guys to deal with. So basically, because I managed to deal with Seymour Stein, he thought I was suitable to actually look after the EG label, and so that I started more or less straight away. And within 2 weeks, I was told basically, can you help Robert Fripp set up some Frippatronics in Pizza Express in London? So I'd never met Robert Fripp. I wasn't that much into King Crimson, but that's how it went basically. And one of obviously the briefs I was given was to look out for new artists, which obviously came later. So we had on EG through Polydor, we had releases from Brian Ferry, who came back with his solo album, Bride Strip Bare. We had the launch of Brian Eno's ambient series, Music for Airports on Land, which was very interesting. And then followed by The League of Gentlemen with Robert Fripp and Sarah Lee on bass. You know Sarah Lee?
Sure.
Lovely.
Sure. Yeah.
Fantastic. Sarah. Yeah, so that sort of brought me up to date.
Well, there's much to unpack with the words you just shared. So, going back to your entry point into the industry, more in the, I guess we'll call it more the executive role in the industry. This would have been 73-ish.
I started in 73 at Phonogram.
73. Okay. And you said, you were working with artists in that time. Define what that means. When you say you were working with artists in this role, were you the guy who was meeting with the artist, talking to them on the phone, dealing with their whatever needs may have come up in those days? How would you say your direct link with these
Well,
artists?
as far as a record company is concerned, the position of label manager or product manager is simply, I suppose you might call them project managers these days. Horrible word, project, though, I think. You were given a catalogue of artists, or a list of artists and their catalogues, plus any new releases from that artist, or any new artists that were signed that you might actually be assigned to look after. So you were the focal point for that artist and that release in the record company. You had to deal with marketing operations in terms of the sales. You had to present to the sales force that release. You had to deal with the radio and TV promotion department, the press department, the art department. So you were a focal point for that list of artists. So the managers obviously might get in touch with the A&R chief that's looking after the artists, but a lot of the time they'll be getting in touch with the label manager or the product manager.
Mhm.
So you're a focal point in the record company.
Sounds like it could be a very colorful position considering some of the acts you've just named. Um, so, I wanted to, and the dilemma I face in this conversation is we could certainly, do a 10-hour deep dive into any facet of what you've just explained. But there's certainly a few artists I wanted to focus on simply because they would be a focal point for my general viewership and my interest as well.
So
You mentioned the two Bryans, Ferry and Eno. Um, and what always struck me about them in particular is they're very different artists in many ways, as best exemplified through their respective solo endeavors. Brian Ferry took a very different direction than Brian Eno did, and of course they were in the same band together. That early Roxy music, I think it was the first three albums, if I'm remembering correctly offhand. Um, how would you describe taking them individually and sort of finding the respective markets for them away from the general Roxy music world that they had together?
well, let me explain a little bit about EG. EG was an EG group, okay? But you had EG Records Limited, you had EG Music Publishing Limited, and you had EG Management.
Mhm.
Only 12 people working at EG, really, directly employees. Brian Eno didn't come into the offices that often, but obviously, especially when I was working at Polydor, with the launch of the Ambient series, which was brand new, really, and work. I didn't have a lot of direct dealings with Brian, but we did obviously talk, and I understood exactly where he was coming from in terms of how he wanted this music to be understood, perceived, and understood, and a joy to work with. And obviously, his visual side was very, very, very important to him too. Brian Ferry, very shy guy, very closely managed. So I didn't have an awful lot of time to hang out with him because there are different ways you can manage an artist, but I suppose basically you want to keep them very close to you. So basically, we weren't encouraged to work that closely with the artist. So my job really was to understand what they wanted, to understand how I can project that and coordinate that into the major record company, because EG was always licensed, the licensor into Island Records and also with Polydor and then later with Virgin. But obviously got to know Brian Ferry a little bit with Bright Strip Bear, which was a fantastic album, which was recorded out in Switzerland. And it allowed him to really come back, I suppose, because obviously Roxy music had sort of taken a break for a while. Then obviously Roxy got together again, and it was a fantastic success. Absolutely fantastic. Brian Ferry just is a workaholic, as is Brian Eno. Absolute workaholic in the studio all the time. You didn't see much of him, but quite a shy guy. A Geordie, came from Easington Colliery, I think his family came from, up there in the northeast. And he worked very closely with an engineer called Rhett Davies. And Rhett Davies was the engineer on all the trio of the three albums, which was Manifesto, Flesh and Blood, and Avalon. So to say that I worked very closely with them, person to person, no, because really the two guys that owned EG, they were the management of the artists, and they dealt more directly with the artists. So, yeah.
Clearly the Ramones had an instantaneous impact in the UK, and I think that was kind of their whole career. That they never really broke in the States, which is tragic.
I didn't know.
It seems overseas, the Ramones had a real stronghold for a lot of people. I have to ask you, because if you look at the Ramones in the 70s, you had four very interesting personalities in the same band. What was your impression of them as a collective? These guys from New York, coming, bringing the city with them wherever they went.
Well, DD was just a laugh, mate. Phonogram, the head office of Phonogram is Philips, basically. It's in Holland. So it was a European tour when they first came over, the Flaming Groovies. So Phonogram provided each member of the band and the crew, I think, with a sort of welcome to the UK kit with stupid things in it, right? Needle and cotton and whatever, maps, stupid stuff, but also some sort of spot ointment or something, which apparently had some sort of chemical in it. So Dee Dee was after this and nicked the tubes off all the other members of the band. But he was a lovely guy, man. Tommy, was it Tommy, the drummer?
Yeah, it would have been Tommy in those days.
Yeah, Tommy, because he actually, I think he co-produced some of the releases.
Yeah.
Johnny was quite standoffish, but they were great guys to work with, man. I went, did quite a few dates with them. They did a fantastic gig up in Liverpool at Dickie's, I think it was called. I think it might have been the old cavern or on that side. No, they were really, really good to work with. And I think, if I remember correctly, Danny Fields was working with them as well. Do you know Danny Fields?
Sure. Yeah.
He worked very closely with Seymour.
Yeah. Danny was managing the Ramones.
That's right. Yeah, he was over. He came over with the guys because he's a publicist as well.
Yeah.
He's still with us, I believe.
He is. Yeah.
Danny.
Yeah. Interesting guy. Yeah, he started out, I think, at Elektra back in the 60s. And his job was to be the weirdo at the label who found all the weirdo bands. So he basically discovered the Stooges and the MC5.
Really?
Then he got the Ramones in the industry. So talk about a track record.
Yeah.
And I don't know how active he is in the industry these days, but I know he's still out and about, as of at least a couple of years ago. So he's still in the mix in some way. But yeah, he was that guy, that ground floor guy who saw Iggy Pop and saw something
Yeah.
there. And thank God for people like that who can spot things as they're happening and realize, wow, there's potential here
Yeah.
beyond whatever tiny dive they happen to be playing at that evening.
Yeah. No, Danny. In fact, my daughter was over just last year at a wedding in New York, and I think Danny was there actually. He was they met up, so he's alive and kicking, mate, which is good
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, fantastic. Um, you mentioned the Boomtown Rats, who haven't come up on this channel yet, and I want to stay on them for a moment because they were one of my favorite bands when I was younger, getting into music. I loved the Boomtown Rats and Geldof in particular. Um, and and they were kind of interesting because they were a band that we could say came from punk rock, yeah, but they also clearly had these commercial sensibilities that made them more palatable to the public than the Ramones were, because of how they looked and the sound of their records, I think were only going to hit a certain cap commercially, as great as they are. The Rats, especially with the big single, I Don't Like Mondays, they had the opportunity to kind of transcend many of their peers. Not to say they were better, because there were a lot of bands that could probably blow the Rats off the stage. But the Rats were the band that kind of, you know what I mean? They became more than some of their contemporaries. Um, so tell me a bit about working with them in that phase. Did you get a sense, being a record industry person, that they would be one of the few bands to, transcend punk rock and make it more of a commercial sounding endeavor?
Well, there's a buzz. There was a hell of a buzz going around about them. Virgin Records were very interested, very, very interested. But Nigel Grange, obviously, he just started, just left Phonogram as head of A&R, and he'd started his own label, Ensign, and obviously that, uh, quite obviously, he licensed it through Phonogram, and asked me if I you know become the label manager, which I did. Um, so he and a guy called Chris Hill, who has a connection with Dire Straits, fun enough, he's no longer on this planet. Chris Hill was a top London DJ, 70s, so you're talking about sort of soul music, sort of like, big guy, very close friend of Nigel Grange, and basically Nigel said, "Look, Chris and I are going over to Dublin. Will you come over with us? Because we want to, see the Boomtown Rats." And we went over. We saw the Boomtown Rats, and it was pretty damn obvious that he was going to sign them. I mean, the first before the set started, basically they had a sort of paper screen across the stage, and then I can't remember which number it was. Might have been Rat Trap. They kicked off with that, lights, very loud. Geldof just ripped this paper apart and just he was sort of almost launched himself onto the audience. Bob, very, very intelligent, very dynamic guy. Loved the ladies. um, and they all lived in a house down outside of London, just on the edge of London, a place called Woking, country house sort of thing, which they wrecked probably. Um, and they just smashed it, man. They absolutely smashed it. Um, it was a joy working with them. Very, I mean, the whole thing, I think, with that new wave punk attitude. I mean, Bob Geldof would be in the record company all the time because he wanted to know what was going on. There was none of this sort of shy and retiring sort of stuff. And Faulkner Kelly, who was their manager at the time, he'd be in there as well. And everybody, basically they were a very, very popular band. I didn't, I mean, as I say, I left Phonogram shortly afterwards, but I obviously was involved with that first release.
Mm. Yeah, and of course they went on to have some fairly massive success there.
Yeah.
Um,
I Don't Like Mondays, obviously, was very, very big.
yeah,
Gary Roberts, bless him, he's no longer with us either. I had a spare room in my flat in Chiswick, and he moved in for about 6 or 7 months. He was the guitarist in the Boomtown Rats. Good guy. Good guy.
yeah, yeah. And there's a
They had an attitude. Obviously, you had Pete Briquette as well, who was
right.
very, very much the heart of the Boomtown Rats musically, I think.
And most of them are still are back together, doing music after all these years, you know.
What else do you do?
It's true. That's true. Um,
You still play, Joel? You must
Yeah,
be.
now and again, now and again. It's for me the idea of getting into a van and loading out drums during a hailstorm on a Tuesday night doesn't really appeal to me much anymore. So I kind of limit what I
Is
do.
that age? Is that age, Joel?
Well, yeah, I think it's just age, and I've done that a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Did that a
No,
lot,
you
and
definitely too, yeah.
you know, I don't achieve it by any means, but I try to make certain things in my life as comfortable as possible at this age. And for me, doing that doesn't appeal to me, but I do special projects, special events here and there. Um, if it's a good gig with the right people, and it's not going to be loading drums up a flight of stairs during a hailstorm on a Tuesday, I'll do it. I also do like studio projects, sharing files and things with people, and
Sure.
that seems to be more comfortable for me. I did all that back in my 20s and early 30s. Um, if I'm going to burn out, I'm going to burn out professionally in ways that earn me a living, which music won't do. So, you kind of have to, you kind of,
Well,
you know,
you got yourself a hell of a thing going now, man. And you've got. I mean, how many? Is it into the thousands or nearly? Podcasts, cars, interviews.
oh, well, I not the podcast. I'm in the hundreds at this point, but I've been writing professionally 25 years, doing various industries. I work full time as a journalist slash ghostwriter. So, um,
Yeah.
I'm doing at least 80 articles a month,
Wow.
and um,
Wow.
I'm not even sure how many published pieces there are at this point. So I can be creative, but in my own place without
Sure.
having to deal with the bass player, without having to deal with the club promoter, all the things that
Yeah. Yeah.
we know go on in the industry. Um, I, I'd much rather be here. Not to
This
say,
is
not to say
progressing in
these
life.
are fun. Yeah.
Things
Uh,
progress, don't they? I mean, but you're still. I mean, music is obviously very, very important to you.
oh yeah. Yeah, it's just I think the trick in 2025 is to find different ways to experience it because as we'll get to in a bit, the model is different now than it was during the days that you're describing. You're describing an industry that actually was an industry. I'm not quite sure what it is today, but we'll dive into that in a second. But I did want to get into EG, specifically a band that we both know and love, which in a weird way is kind of how we're connecting today. That, of course, being Killing Joke. Um, one of the most colorful, not only bands, but combination of personalities you will likely experience on this earth. And you were very ground floor for Killing Joke, right? You were kind of involved in getting them involved in EG to begin with, correct?
Well, so Phonogram, year and a half off managing 90 degrees, and then got offered a job at Polydor. And for some reason, I think it was the probably 1979 summer. Had to do a presentation to the sales force. I was also looking after one or two other acts as well, which was and apparently I made this presentation to the sales force. And the two guys that own EG were there because obviously I was their label manager. And anyway, it turned out they said, look, we're going to offer you a job. So why? Yeah, okay. Well, the way you were talking about new wave and punk and this and that, maybe you should be the person that we're looking for new artists. Um, so obviously, I took the job. So and I actually started. I think it was more or less beginning of January 1980. But I'd seen in my red Cortina, I'd come back to the red Cortina, driving up Uxbridge Road into Shepherd's Bush, and there was this 60 by 40 poster, and it was for Psych
Mm.
and War Dance, And basically, it was Mike Cole's wonderful artwork. Basically, you've got this sort of futuristic block of flats, and you've got the jester, and it's in red, black, and white. And basically, you've got the jester jumping out at you. And I thought, this fucking poster, man, something else. I love it. Anyway, I had a friend of mine, he was general manager at the time, he became MD, Willie Richardson at Virgin Records, because I had quite a few Irish friends. And I asked Willie one day, I said, look, can you recommend anybody? He said, well, why don't you go and see our guy, Neil, at the Virgin Warehouse in West Kensington? So once again, in my little red Cortina, popped round there one night, one evening, arranged to meet him. And he said, have you heard Killing Joke? And I said, well, I saw this poster the other day. And he basically played the Island EP to me, right? 12-inch, Are You Receiving, Turn to Red. And I was in straight away, bang. That was it. I just fell in love with it, mate. Absolutely fell in love with it. So I said, Neil, because obviously they were distributing they were obviously distributing to an extent to their shops, any and all records. And that included the Island EP and also Wood on Psych. So I said to Neil, I said, right, by any chance, you have the telephone number of the manager of Killing Joke? And he said, yes, fair enough. So I got the telephone number. And the next day I phoned this guy, Brian Taylor. Mm-hmm. Brian Taylor was part of the four-man Malicious Damage. Really good guys. And Brian was postgraduate, very intelligent guy, very, very intelligent, very left-wing. And we spoke on the phone first of all, then he came into the offices, and he was hard work. I mean, in a nice way, because he wanted the very best for Killing Joke, not money-wise, but the right company. And so basically, I was bitten. I had to go over to Dublin to see another band called the Blades. I also saw U2 out there at the time. And I was staying at Jury's Hotel, playing this Killing Joke, getting a bang on the front from the guests next door saying, shut up. But at the same time, the two owners, Mark Fennick and Sam Alder, and a guy called Paddy Spinks, bless him, I said, go and see Killing Joke. They're playing at this gay club in Soho called Billy's. Now, Killing Joke are not gay. They just like to play in different odd places. So the next morning I rang, I actually spoke to Paddy and I said, what do you think? He said, all three of us are in completely. Mm. So the Malicious Damage crew came in and basically negotiated a deal, and it was a good deal as well because it was for recording and music publishing, which these days you probably would call a conflict of interest. But, and that's how it started, basically, because I don't think Killing Joke really were not an EG type of artist, so I don't think that they would have actually come anywhere near EG. Mm. But in many ways, it was fortunate that they did, because Malicious Damage were good management, but they weren't that experienced. And obviously, when it came to Jazzcom and shooting off to Iceland, joined by Geordie after the Brighton gig of the Revelations tour, Malicious Damage were really a bit lost on this. So EG management, in a way, came unofficially to help. And I think, I don't know exactly how it happened, but with a girlfriend of Jazz's, and it was like a go-between on the phone to them in Iceland, Geordie and Jazz. Eventually they came back, and obviously Big Paul stayed with Killing Joke, and Youth decided, fuck off, I've had enough of you guys for the time being. So he went off to be an A&R guy at Atlantic. Mm. Obviously, in the meantime, while they were in Iceland, Big Paul and Youth obviously formed Brilliant.
Right. This was also around the time, the era you're describing, we're seeing the arrival of Paul Raven, who replaces you. You know, 'cause Youth goes on to have this extraordinary career under his own steam, producing Bloody Paul McCartney and everybody else. I mean, Youth has become, his own thing. Raven comes on board. This is around the time of the Ha Live EP.
Yeah.
Um, I've always wondered because that record sounds so good as a live recording. It's one of the, I mean, particularly for 82 or
Connie
whatever it
Blank.
was, it sounds fantastic for a live record. Why is it only an EP? Why not a full-length album?
Right. Okay. So Connie had produced or co-produced Revelations out on his at his farm studio out in Germany near Cologne, and to get Killing Joke into America was very important. So obviously dates were set up, and part of the contract that obviously EG had with Polydor was you could call upon a live album, and so we took the opportunity. We asked Connie if he could actually if he would actually arrange this, organize it. Obviously, we paid for it. So he did he got in touch with the right mobile recording studio in Toronto, and it was all set up. But this is where it went wrong. So you got a mobile studio sitting outside Larry's Hideaway. Now I think it probably would have been a Studer, and a Studer could really only take a 12-inch reel. But Connie wanted to record the whole concert without having to break it halfway through, because the length of the multi-track was not the time length of obviously their set. So he wanted to obviously not disturb it at all. So he put a 14-inch reel onto a 12-inch machine basically, and it was working okay. But at a certain point, the weight of that 14-inch reel and the weight of the tape, because you're talking this heavy stuff, at a certain point it started to go like this. It started to go fast, go slow, because of the weight. So he didn't check this until the second night, at the end of the second night of recording. And that's when it was discovered that basically only 6 tracks were able to be saved. There's nothing that can be done about it at all. That is 100% the truth, mate.
Oh, wow.
Don't put a 14-inch multi-track onto a machine that only takes 12-inch reels. Because you're obviously talking about 2 machines, right? You've got one machine there, you've got one machine there, and it's obviously you understand?
Yeah, I understand completely.
Pain in the ass.
Yeah.
But you're right, absolutely fantastic recording and performance was really, really spot on.
Yeah, I love that record. It's actually one of my favorite Killing Joke releases, period.
I agree.
Talk about a band on fire in those days. No pun intended with Fire Dances, which came next.
Yeah.
And it really didn't take long. I would say by Fire Dances comes out, then we see Nighttime, Love Like Blind.
Just one sec. Fire Dances was the point when he actually moved on to onto the Gibson ES 295, wasn't it? Before that, he was on the Solid.
Well, let's stay on that for a minute because certainly there was a sound that came from that man that was distinctly his that the world will not hear again in new form because the man's gone upstairs at this point.
Yeah.
You worked with this band so intimately and were there as ground floor as one can be, prior to the EG deal. What in your mind made Geordie? I mean, and why can't that band continue now without him to some degree? No matter what they end up doing, remains to be seen, but it will not be Killing Joke without Geordie Walker.
You've got to change the name. If there was no, you can't. Rest in peace, Geordie.
Yeah.
with grace. Uh, can't be repeated. Can't be repeated. And the, his Gibson, when he first basically he bought it from a place in Hanwell, which is where I lived, funnily enough, and Paulie lived just down the road. Obviously, different times, but this is where, at least for Paulie. So Peter Cook Guitars was just a little shop in a cul-de-sac of terraced houses, old terrace houses opposite a park. You'd never know it was there. That's where he bought his Gibson ES 295, and that's where Paulie later bought his guitar from Peter Cook.
Mm.
And I remember Geordie, because he came in, obviously, basically he'd seen this guitar, and he wanted a bit more money, basically. So we extended the advance, and he went and bought it.
Mm.
Peter Cook Guitars, Hanwell W7.
Well, good thing you threw him
And
the.
the thing about Geordie is that obviously I don't know exactly, but he was born in County Durham. He was born, I believe, brought up in Chesterless Street, and then obviously his parents moved to Milton Keynes. So when you're a kid, man, and you lose all your friends, you go somewhere else, another part of the country. Milton Keynes is not the best of places to move to. It's a bit of a desert. So he used to come back from school and just play the guitar, and he taught himself the guitar.
Just,
And
I
we all know. I mean, he's iconic. The way he actually has just brought that Gibson to life. You know, there's Scotty Moore in 1952 and 53 with Elvis Presley in Las Vegas, and there's Geordie standing on stage with almost the same model guitar, and getting the most incredible sounds out of it. And this is where obviously he and jazz sort of bounced off each other.
mm, mm. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we could go on about Geordie. I don't know if we need to, because how do you describe that in words? You know, you just have to listen to the bloody thing and realize what the man offered. You know.
This tall, very good-looking guy, man, with a fucking guitar. Jesus, you couldn't get better, man. I mean, the sounds he'd get, and Jimmy Page obviously recognised, you know, and they got to know each other mutually through a guy called Terry Cox, bless him, mate. I'm sure you've probably heard about Terry Cox from members of Killing Joke. They'll tell you quite a lot. That's how he met Jimmy Page, because Terry was looking after Jimmy Page at the time. And obviously, one guitarist to another, you can recognise, you know, the talent that he had.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there's a moment in Killing Joke's history um, where it appeared there would be some likelihood of this band achieving mainstream success. So that would have been Nighttime, Love Like Blood, 80s. Um, which I don't think ever really happened again in Killing Joke's history, you know, where they had that moment where it was like, oh, you know, this could be a band that will sell records and you know, potentially top the charts. Um, what was that era like for you doing with them? Because they'd gone from doing that earlier material, then suddenly their faces are on the record covers, and they're hitting the charts with essentially a ballad, you know, with Love Like Blood. I mean, it must have been a kind of a shell shock for the label to suddenly have this very esoteric band displaying some kind of commercial potential there.
Well, first time they worked with the producer, really. I mean, okay, they worked with Connie Plank, but who really let them get on with it in many ways. But I mean, incredible producer. But obviously, with Nighttime, Chris Kimsey was invited in. They knew of him. We knew of him. He'd obviously worked with Rolling Stones. He was a principal engineer at Olympic Studios in London. and a guy that they could get on with because Killing Joke destroyed engineers. Ask Nick Launay, ask Phil Harding, first two albums. When I say destroyed, of course they didn't destroy them, but they gave them a really hard time,
Mm.
you know, in a nice way. In other words, kept the engineers on their toes because in those first three albums, or the first two albums in particular, they produced themselves,
Yeah.
and it worked. It really did. So there was a progression. I suppose you've got to say that they needed to not become more commercial because when you look at that album, it's you know it's got some pretty heavy tracks on it, but it's very well produced.
Mm.
And, and there's a guy there because obviously it was done at Hamsterton Studios in Berlin, and this is before the wall came down, Joel. And Hamsterton Studios, which is an old Victorian building basically, and they used to record orchestras in there. So that's where Killing Joke were able to put down their backing tracks. Big, big room. So obviously you've got your ambient mics up there, you know, and then you've got your close miking, great sound. But the guy that really, I think, worked with Chris on that was the principal engineer at Hamsterton, a guy called Thomas Stieler. And he'd actually done a jump over the wall a few years beforehand. Very, very good engineer. And it just turned out incredibly well. It really, really did. Love Like Blood, very different from Killing Joke. But it worked. It worked. I think Germany really, there's another story here actually. The day before they actually started recording at Hansaton, on the first or second floor was the mixing suite, right? And this was in the early days of the solid state logic SSL desks. Now if you were standing, you had also a panoramic view of the wall, which was only probably about 300 yards, 300 or 400 meters away. And apparently they were playing around in the mixing room, and Geordie gets hold of a fire extinguisher and starts spraying the stuff all over the place, and it lands on the SSL desk. And they haven't even started recording, Joel. So we get a phone call the next morning to say, you've got a problem here. Fortunately, it didn't damage the desk, but that's pretty corrosive stuff. So once that starts to seep in, it was obviously wiped off pretty quickly. That was Geordie. Mm-hmm. That was a sort of thing he got up to. Mm-hmm. But also Adorations was recorded there as well, but that went a little bit awry.
How so?
Well, it was remixed. Recording was all right. I just think other things came to play. Mm. Personally, it was Julian Mendelssohn was the engineer. Worked with Trevor Horn. Mm-hmm. Chris was having a bit of a hard time. So basically, Julian Mendelssohn remixed it and used an awful lot of effects, sucked out an awful lot of the air out of it, basically. I mean, Adorations, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, great album, but not Killing Joke. Mm. Mm. From that, Joel, you can probably tell that it's the first four albums with it.
Yeah. Yeah. As it is for many people, really. You know, oddly enough, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns was my first Killing Joke record I ever bought. And then I went backwards, you know, from there. Now, this is where things in Killing Joke's history get very, very chaotic for a bit. You know, Big Paul departs. They do Outside the Gate, which is probably an entirely different hour-long conversation.
Like 5 minutes.
Or 5 minutes, yeah. I mean, this is, you know, the reason why I bring this up is this is when, historically speaking, if you listen to the band's narrative, this is when Killing Joke and E.G. have some issues. You know, things get a little hazy between the two parties. Is that fair to say?
Not just Killing Joke. EG blew itself up, shot himself in the foot. That's why it doesn't exist anymore. Be very careful when you're successful in one particular line of business about actually then moving into another line of business that you don't know much about, and you borrow lots of money, and it all blows up in your face. And the record company has to sell its music, publishing, and record catalogue. I go no more really. Say no more really. It's pretty obvious that the guys that owned EG decided that they'd get into other businesses, and there was a couple of financial crashes internationally at the end of the 80s, and that didn't help them at all. And eventually, I lost my job. EG closed down. So it was not just Killing Joke. Ask Robert Fripp.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So Killing Joke's parting record for EG was Outside the Gate, which again, if the common narrative is followed, wasn't even supposed to be a Killing Joke record. It was sort of an EG mandate at that point to put it out as Killing Joke because Jazz had gone a bit over budget, let's say, with that record. But that's another example of an album that's not really Killing Joke. You know, it's got
No,
the band on it, you know.
no, probably not really. It's um, it's funny enough because a lot of it was recorded in the recording studio that EG had bought just down just off Kings Road, White House Studios. Yeah, yeah. I can't say it's my favourite album from Killing Joke by any means. It's more of a solo album for Jazz in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. An odd note to leave with, you know, considering, but then again, as you said, EG was circling the drain a bit at that point, it seems.
Well, we'd actually right. Okay, so we'd been licensed. EG had been licensed through Polydor, and then the principal artist at EG had quite a lot of influence in actually the whole catalogue, record EG records and Editions EG going to Virgin. So the second half of the 80s for EG, as far as I was concerned, wasn't that great.
Mm.
I could say more, Joel, but what's the
I
point?
I get it.
I mean, Polydor had broken Roxy, had broken the reform Roxy music, Brian Ferry, and they sold an awful lot of records, man, awful lot of records. But a particular artist wanted to go to Virgin, and Richard Branson was very much involved in sort of romancing, and that's what happened. So, second half of the 80s to me was obviously transferring the whole catalogue of EG records and Editions EG, all the CDs, all the masters, all the tapes, all the artwork. Polydor was an absolute joy to work with. Virgin were quite tough.
Mm. So putting the 80s behind, we're now into the 90s. You continue in the industry, but in more of a freelance.
Yeah, it was pretty tough actually, Joel. But yeah, do you know what? It was two things, two particular people, artists at EG, that really got an awful lot to thank them for. One was a guy called Simon Jeffs. Now he was the composer and principal founder of the Penguin Cafe Orchestra that was on Editions EG, that had also been out on Brian Eno's Obscure label at Island. And then when EG moved to Polydor, it was released on Editions EG. So Simon Jeffs offered me a job. So basically, for about a year or so, I was working with them on the marketing, promotion, management to a degree. Uh, and that lasted for about 18 months. And then Dr. Patterson, such a good guy, man. He offered me a gig for a year or so working with him on the org
Mm.
um, up in North Street in Battersea. And that was great. And that's how I met Amoeba Assassin.
Again, you mentioned the Orb. I mean, I think in many ways the Orb in the 90s were a bit like, not necessarily musically, but as far as like boundary pushing stuff, they were kind of like taking the mantle from Killing Joke from the early 80s, I found.
Well, Alex had been with Killing Joke along with a guy called Phil. They'd gone on deck. They were like crew and friends, and sort of basically lived all in the same squats together, probably. Um, and I think it was probably around about mid 80s. Alex used to come into the offices at EG, on a regular basis, and everybody liked him. Basically, he said, "Can I come and work here?" And everybody said yes. So he came and worked. He worked with me and everybody else at EG. Um, and during that period of time, obviously, he was friends with Jimmy Corti,
Right.
ALF, and they lived in the same area, south of the river in Battersea, and they started the music of the Orb. Alex always loved, he was really into Brian Eno's ambient music. And of course, he perfected ambient house, and it's him who did it. Yeah, it was Paul Oakenfold, who was having a night at a club. Oh, I can't remember what it's called now, but basically, a club down in Charing Cross in central London. And Paul said to him, "We've got a particular room. It's like a chill out room. Can you play your ambient music in there?" You know, and that's where that's when he started DJing,
Mm.
and that's sort of the early days of the Orb and the ideas really. But there was definitely an influence of what Brian Eno had produced with the ambient music and the way Alex just took hold of it and obviously put beats to it, and he worked with Jimmy, but then obviously he started to work with Chris Weston, then Andy Hughes, and now they're coming back on the road again, Joel, which is great in London and the UK, which is good news.
Yeah, fantastic. I saw the Orb here in Boston. Gosh, how many years ago was that? Maybe 8 or so years ago, maybe a little longer. Um, Fantastic stuff. And of course, you mentioned Mike Coles, who sort of
Yeah,
resurrected Malicious Damage and put out quite a few things with the Orb, including a wonderful box set I have here. I mean, it's kind of amazing, Alec, when you consider the group of creative minds that came out of that. We'll call it the Killing Joke world, for want of a better description. You've got Alex Patterson, you've got Mike Coles, you've got the fellas in Killing Joke. Um, an interesting bunch of people. None of them think conventionally by any means. You have a conversation with any one of those people, and you realize you're talking to a different sort, and you put them all together, and we know what happened, So, but it's always fascinating to me. Someone like Mike Coles, the unsung hero of the Killing Joke story. I mean, talk
yeah,
about visually, that poster got your attention,
yeah.
how critical those images were to telling that band's story. Even before you heard the first note, you knew there was something different about that band.
Yeah. No, the Michael's just brilliant artwork, mate. I mean, you could escape into it. You could see where he's coming from. I mean, it's like the depression, basically in the UK. At any rate, there was workers' marches, and he took one of these workers' marches, a photograph, and then sort of basically just didn't really change it that much, but caricatured it a little bit, and then Joker's sort of jumping out, and from just escapist artwork, which absolutely perfectly suited Killing Joke. Really did, really, really did.
Yeah.
And he's still there, man. He's working away. I mean, I haven't seen Mike Coles for years and years and years and years, but yeah, bless him, man, bless him.
Yeah, yeah, great guy, great guy. I met up with him in
He's obviously a Geordie as well, or at least he's from County Durham up there. You know, he's a why I man champion.
yeah, I met up with him in London a few years back. I was playing out there. And interesting about Mike, he's not the most gregarious fellow in conversation. I had him on my old podcast many years ago when I was doing audio podcasts. And
Yeah,
he's very kind of quiet,
yeah.
not somebody who would take over the room. He's not jazz, okay? Maybe that's the best way to describe it. But you look at Mike's artwork and you know there's a deviousness and a subversiveness to
Oh,
what he does. He's like the quiet maniac in the room. You just wouldn't know it by talking to him.
but when he does talk, mate, he's very clear, very, very Geordie, very succinct,
Yeah.
dry sense of humour.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I love that in people. I love people you can't quite figure them out, until you see what their
Oh,
output might be and you go, "Oh, okay, now I understand completely." Fascinating guy. Um,
I think that whole malicious damage was they need they found each other. You had four guys in malicious damage. Obviously, you had Mike Coles, you had Adam, who ran the WoW label latterly up in Sheffield, Dick, and Brian Taylor. But obviously, the continuing person is of malicious damage, and what they stood for is very much Mike Coles all over the last 20, 30 years, really.
yeah,
He's, he's, uh, he's been important to Killing Joke, very important, I think.
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, to bring things up to a more current context, are you still active in the music industry or have you retired at this point?
No, no. The only thing that I did after working with the Orb was, through the Orb actually. Claire Pretty, that's the Welsh way of spelling it, Priti. Claire worked for Alex, and I was working, and we basically worked in the same room, same office. And one of our jobs was to listen to demos. And one day we listened to this demo, and we both looked at each other and went, "Wow!" And this was Amoeba Assassin. So
Hmm.
this is not a rock band. This is Andy Gray and a guy called Steve Saker. Steve was the vocalist and lyricist, and Andy was the producer of the music. Really, an absolute whiz kid. Um, and we got to meet them, and basically we ended up co-managing Amoeba Assassin. They got to number 2 in the mix mag with Roller Coaster. This was 4 on the floor, but sort of with a techno hinge to it. Not overly commercial, but they're fantastic live as well.
Hmm.
Just the two of them. We fly up to Aberdeen, up to Blackburn, Burnley, London, Bristol. So I worked with them for 2 or 3 years as Amoeba Assassin. And that was pretty successful. And Andy now he's out in America, I think, on the West Coast, working with Paul Oakenfold. He did some of the soundtrack for Get Carter 2. And then nothing after that, Joel, until obviously Paulie starts to put his finger out and get it on. And he certainly has.
Hmm.
I tell you what, mate, it's a ray of sunshine, that band.
Oh, absolutely. Light of Eternity. Yeah.
I'm very close to it, obviously. But,
Yeah. It's nice to see. It's nice to see. I just wrote about this recently from my website. It's nice to see Big Paul moving forward with things under his own steam. You know, the world kind of needs his drums in it. I don't want to imagine a world without his playing. The same way it's difficult to imagine Geordie not here. Paul Ferguson. Um, to me, Paul was the secret weapon of Killing Joke because when I saw them when they came back around after Raven had passed on and Youth rejoined, they came and played the US. I think it must have been 2010. And I saw them at a not a huge place, but a decent sized venue in Boston. And, jazz is jazz. He's got the face thing. He's doing his jazz bit, Geordie's got the stance, the whole thing. Never really changes beyond this. Brilliant. I'm watching Paul, and and his eyes could burn a hole through the back of the club. I've never seen such focus and just raw, in the moment. I'm thinking that's Killing Joke right there. That's the spirit of Killing Joke.
You got it
Because
in one. You got it in one. Yeah. What a guy, mate. His personality and character when he just comes through when he's playing, when you see him playing live, man, and it's just connection. I mean, what a drummer. Self-taught, iconic. He's just a one-off, mate. I mean, rock music, industrial rock, punk rock, whatever. This guy is right at the top of the tree as far as a rock drummer is concerned. Absolutely. Absolutely. And he was, I have to say it, mate, from a distance, because I wasn't in touch with them, from a distance, he seems to be wasting himself away because they were all over the, different parts of the, obviously youth in London, you've got Jazz and Geordie in Prague, Big Paul in Baltimore. It was getting a bit thin, from my opinion anyway. And I think, honestly and truly, that he's obviously working with Seven Dials, but working with Paulie, he's found something he really can express himself through, and Paulie vice versa. Really, it's a dream come true, mate. To me, it really works. And then Olga, I believe, I might have this wrong, but I think I'm right. Olga, Big Paul's wife, was the person who suggested Fred.
yeah. Yeah, Fred's from where I'm from
I
in
know.
New Jersey. My favorite singer from New Jersey. I love Fred Schreck. I think he's one of the great unheralded
Absolutely.
frontmen, and to see him now, because Paul and Fred had worked together in the 90s doing that Crush band, which was on
Yeah.
Atlantic.
Can't Stop the Rain. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a wonderful song.
It is. It is.
But I like the fact that Fred is kind of getting, the greater attention that he deserves because the guy's been putting out great records since at least 1991. So I'm so thrilled to see Light of Eternity exist because there has to be forward motion with things. And I like the fact that it's Paul's thing, because I always, like I say, I always thought he had more of an influence over what Killing Joke was than a lot of people would realize. I think he was kind of the silent engine for so
Yeah.
much.
I was treated as well.
Yeah. So it's lovely to see Light of Eternity come to.
Well, I think the chemistry between the three of them, and then the crazy thing is that obviously Paul is in northeast Thailand.
Mhm. Right.
Big Paul's obviously in Baltimore, and Fred's in Tennessee. He's an
Right.
expat. He's an expat from New Jersey. What the hell's he doing? It must have been love. It must have been. I don't know. Anyway, but his voice, it's exceptional. He's got. It's so diverse. It's so he can call upon. Whether it be spoken word, he can just sound effects with his voice. You can hear it the way Paul is mixing, and he can belt out. He can belt out a chorus, something else, mate.
Oh,
But
yeah.
his lyrics really make sense. He's a wordsmith. I tell you what, the chemistry between these three of three parts is more like fucking 5 or 6 parts, mate. Honestly, it's a one-off, mate. It's got to carry on. It's got to. And
Yeah.
live, I just can't wait. Paulie, obviously with KSA, he's pretty damn experienced playing live, and obviously Big Paul is, and I think Fred's probably got to dust himself down a little bit. But they'll be over shortly, mate, in a couple of months or so to rehearse.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that. they perform in the States as well, beyond the Ministry
It's
jaunt.
all,
They
it's all
have.
getting a bit dodgy out there, isn't it?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I want to see where this goes from here. You know, they've got the two EPs already, which came out very quickly after one another. So, yeah, I'm
Well,
excited.
it's just a very natural writing partnership between all three of them, and
Yeah,
and that is rare. That is rare. It is rare, and but it really, it's like bullseye, bullseye, bullseye. Bang.
and you know the joke about Big Paul and I. Now, first of all, Paul's arms are like tree trunks, so this would never happen. But I'm always saying like, I'm going to
No,
punch him in the mouth when I see him because as a drummer, there's no way you can compare to that. I mean, he sent me the first EP. You know, hey, have a listen. I'm like, of course, you know. So I wrote him. I said, hey, Paul, are you using drum machines on this record? He's like, no, that's all me. And I'm like, you.
no, it's all authentic. It's all authentic,
Yeah,
honestly.
but it's so tight. It sounds like a drum machine. So I wrote him. I said, "Are you using machines here, man?" He's like, "Nope, that's all me." And I'm like, "Game
No,
over." You know,
absolutely,
fucking give up
absolutely.
now. You know, it's just I should just throw my sticks away for good. You
No,
know.
no, I'm Paulie very much. If you record something, you've got to be able to play it live,
Yeah.
and that's the way it works. And obviously, um, no, it's. I keep playing it. I mean, I've been playing just a short while ago before we started. I was playing another track which you haven't heard yet, um, and it's called Worlds Collide. Unless they change the title, but that will obviously be will be coming. You know, will be heard on the tour. So yeah, I really believe. I mean, right, the DSPs. They've had a problem with the DSPs. We won't go into that, but it's all about them actually buy it on Bandcamp, go out and play live. Buy it from Kiddies Music on vinyl. Forget the DSPs. Honestly and truly, I don't want to get sort of sidetracked, but they've got to go, mate. I fucking hate them. 1,000 plays and you get £2.40,
Oh yeah, yeah.
0.03% of a penny.
Mhm.
These fat cats are sitting there in bloody California, which is right here. Sorry, mate. Sort of
Oh,
just diverging there a bit.
well, that kind of leads me to the question I wanted to wrap up with in that, you know, you were working professionally in the 70s and 80s, a vastly different industry to what we're seeing now. And I suspect I may know some of the answers to this question based on what you've just said. But what are your thoughts on the industry in 2025? I mean, first of all, is there even still an industry left? And you know, and how can an artist navigate what the hell we're looking at now to, you know, find some sort of career stability with the models we're seeing in the present tense?
Uh, tough one. Tough one, Joel. Where can they play? Where can they play? Can they play in a back room of a pub anymore? No, doesn't happen. Where I've moved on from bands actually. I really have. So I'm going to let you down here. I've got a couple of CDJs and a Pioneer 850. And I like mixing drum and bass, hardcore, jungle.
Hmm.
I'm not that interested in going to see bands anymore. And that's not a good thing because it's not turning me on. I mean, I listened the other day for the first time, probably for years, to something, or looked at the UK top charts, and I played some of them. Jesus, man, it's depressing. Look, hippies were young, right? You had young hippies, you had some old hippies, but you had young hippies. So basically, you're talking about teenage years, right? Into your 20s. Punk, up, finger up to prog rock and Sweet and Slade and that type of music. And basically, I can't really play, but I'm going to somebody's taught me a couple of chords, and I'm just going to do that. And that's how it started. Because basically, it was kids saying, just don't like what my dad's listening to. There's a whole attitude as well. This is the late 70s, obviously, in the UK. Were pretty depressing times, economically and such like. So there was every opportunity. And then towards the end of the 80s, you've got acid house.
Hmm.
And acid house started to turn into hardcore and jungle. Now, obviously, that's not musicians at all. But when you go and see the people enjoying this music, like really getting off on it, you can't really criticize it. You really can't. So I'm not quite sure. Personally, I'm always looking for voices, singing voices, especially female,
Hmm.
with a lot of program music, so to speak. With drum and bass in particular, the female voice just really does work. Obviously, the male voice is more like an MC thing. Yeah, it's so I'm just hanging on to Light of Eternity. Hello, mate. They're, they're my pleasure.
Hmm. Where do you see the industry going? I mean, if there's no such thing as a crystal ball, but you've been around a bit. I mean, you know, are there positives that you're seeing that could steer the ship in a clearer way moving forward with the right tools in place and the right sort of foresight?
Opportunities for bands, young bands, to be able to play live. In this country, I don't know about in America, but I mean, obviously, we've had austerity since 2010, and then obviously Labour come in. So that particular government for the last 15 years basically closed. It was like cut back, cut back. So closed all the youth clubs, the
Mm.
places where they can meet. We've got a lot of trouble on the streets these days because kids, they're being influenced by gangs and selling drugs and all this sort of thing. Basically, what's happened to the youth club? There aren't any.
Mm.
Also, there's an awful lot of single parents, so therefore there's a lack of males in a lot of kids' lives. Um, just give them the opportunity to play live somewhere, because you give a 12-year-old or 14-year-old a drum kit or a guitar, away from school and a music lesson, just have a bash away on that, play them a bit of music in the background or whatever that dad likes, you can turn their heads, girls and boys.
Yeah.
Not a great answer, I'm afraid, Joel, but there you go.
Well, I never truly imagined a time where music's not going to be important to people's lives. I don't have a crystal ball as far as the ongoing, necessary monetization, making money off of music. I don't see how we're gonna keep that going, but music will find a way, I mean, even if we have to sell it out of the trunk of our cars, it'll still get out there.
It's
It's
about the
just,
kids. It's about the kids.
yeah.
They've got to be turned on because that's how you got into it, at that young age. It's how I got into it, you know. And you follow a fashion. Your mates are doing it. Your peers are doing it. You swap stories. You swap records. And then somebody says, "Oh, Jesus, you've got quite a good voice." Oh, okay. Well, I can play the guitar a bit. That I don't know. I mean, I'm not really connected with any youth particularly. So I'd like to have a conversation with them, but I don't know. Some of this R&B music, mate, and urban stuff, mate, it's just shit. It's absolute shite. It's programmed. It's auto-tuned. Uh, Depressing. So what are we going to do, Joel? What are we going to do? You and I.
I think you're right. Couple of baldies talking about, what's going to happen next. It's not going to be up to us. It's going to be up to those younger people, you know.
Well,
Um,
you got a lad, haven't you? 'Cause,
yeah, yeah, and it's
what's he into?
I'm sorry.
What's he into? What's he musically?
He is thankfully all over the place because he grew up with myself and his mother. So we had him listening to everything from Amanda Palmer to Magazine. you know. And he sponged it all up. And music is quite important to him, but he doesn't have that notion that we would have at his age, like, oh, we have to go see the band play. We have to, buy the record. He's just not of that generation. Like, he's into gaming and things. He's in his early 20s,
Yeah,
So he's hearing music all the time, but it isn't that sort of prize that it was for younger generations. We go to the record store after hearing the song on the radio and buy the record.
yeah,
It's a different experience. So I think music is as impactful as it's ever been. It's just, the making a living off of it part is challenging. That's why you're seeing so many veteran acts. We talked about Roxy music. They came through a couple years ago, um, not not young men anymore, but Roxy music is going to sell tickets, right? Versus the newer upstart bands, the promoters don't want to take a gamble on. So that's why we're constantly seeing these heritage acts
yeah, yeah,
swinging
yeah,
around again.
absolutely.
Uh, it'll be interesting to see what the next 10 years bring, because inevitably, just by nature, a lot of these acts we're still seeing will not be here in 10 years. They're not
Yeah,
going to survive. So,
you can almost count it down, can't you?
yeah, I think once we see the end of the guys who are still in it, from the 60s and 70s, um, what's going to replace it? But having said that, I had a conversation with someone recently about being of a certain age where we're not tapped into the youth anymore. I said, for all we know, there may be this extraordinary underground scene somewhere that we have no knowledge of because it's not for us. Um, I'm
Yeah,
hopeful that's the case, that there will be something moving forward. But having said that,
I
it's
think there will be. I think we can only just sort of hope and guess maybe what might happen, but maybe the generation that's maybe 7 or 8, 10, 11 years old, maybe there's going to be a generation that goes, fuck this gaming, I
yeah.
want to pick up a guitar. But they have to be given a reason to do that, something that excites them, something to actually fight against, because surely these kids are not going to just be sitting in rooms for the rest of their lives, just on, gaming, and then more kids coming up. We, I'm not a gamer, mate. So I never have been. I don't particularly want to be. Uh, we just need a bit of a revolution from the kids,
Well, they have the
a bit
kids.
of a bit of attitude, the right sort of attitude. But
Well, the bottom line is the kids, despite what generation they come from, have never let history down before,
uh,
right? I mean, from this, certainly from the 60s onwards, the kids
yeah, yeah,
will always find a way,
yeah,
and because of who we are, we may not even know what their way is going to be, but I'm hopeful they're going to find something.
right.
Even if it's something that we would never agree to or expect. Maybe the music is going to be totally different in everything, presentation, sound, what they're into. Um, but we just have to wait and see, but at least in the meantime, we have our respective journeys, and certainly your journey's been very colorful. And I cannot thank you enough for coming on here and sharing a bit of it. It's been absolutely fascinating having you on, sir.
No, it's good to meet you, Joel, man. It's good to meet you because you got a big smile, man, and you got a nice beard as well. Quite jealous. Mine's all white.
Yeah, mine's getting there, man. I don't mind. I've earned it. I've earned everything that fell off my head. I've earned everything going gray here. I've every wrinkle is a story, so I'm fine.
Good man. Good man.
But it's been fantastic, sir. I
Well, thank you.
really do appreciate it. Give my best to Mr. Williams when you talk to him next.
I
And tell
certainly will.
Paulie, I know you're watching. Talk to your drummer, all right? You know what I'm talking about. Talk to your drummer, buddy.
Well, thank you, Joel, for I mean your review of the EP of the second EP, and you referred to the danceability of Big Paul Ferguson and the tracks, and you absolutely 100% right, mate, because there is a groove there, and Paulie likes that as well. There's a real groove there, and well, I mean, I think was it 155 is fascist. Should I say that name, fascist? No, no, it's good stuff, mate. Well, it's good to meet you, Joel. Good to
Yeah,
meet
likewise. And
you.
my door is always open. If you ever want to come back, that would be fantastic.
Well, I
And
certainly check out your interviews, mate. The one you did with way back now, isn't it? I think it was last year with Fred was really good. I enjoyed that.
thank you. That was what started this whole thing off,
Yeah,
actually. So yeah, I love Fred, and as I said, it's just such a joy to see collectively where those fellows are going with things. And I love Fred to death. I love Big Paul to death. Paulie, the whole thing they're doing with this band is fantastic. So you guys keep doing what you're doing. We'll be along for the ride for sure.
tell you what, man, Paulie's sense of humour is pretty savage.
I would imagine.
I tell you what, Big Paul and Fred don't know what they've let themselves in for. Really. He's a
Well,
prankster. He's a prankster.
I suppose we'll hear some tour stories once the ministry runs
Yeah,
over.
are you going to come over?
I'm not sure. I was talking to a friend of mine about doing a gig out there this year, but it's a
Yeah,
little,
why not?
economically in the States is a little dodgy right now.
Yeah, yeah,
So I'm erring on a side of self-preservation at the moment, and just sort of like staying a bit closer to home, in case the goddamn sky falls. It's better if it
it's
falls.
getting lower, isn't it?
Sorry?
The sky's getting lower.
It is getting lower. It hasn't crashed yet, so there's still some hope, but again, I think at least for this year I need to stay home. I need to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sure things are cool over the next few months because, it could be dodgy, it could be not a
yeah.
problem, but got to make sure I got enough to kind of thrive on here and not take any, overseas trips that cost a few grand right now if I could avoid it. So
Well,
probably not this time, but maybe
you
next.
come over, when you come over, mate, we must meet up, obviously, and yeah, definitely.
Absolutely, we can count on that. But until
We'll have,
then,
a drink, we'll have a drink with Mike Coles, you and me, right? Get the Guinness out or whatever.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, Mike, we'll have to do that. But until then, we will keep in touch on the interwebs, as they say. And
Yeah.
we'll talk again soon, my friend. Thank you
Okay.
again.
Thank you, Joel.